This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello and welcome to the show. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and today I have a very special guest on. In the past, we've talked about a lot of esoteric topics on this show. And one thing that I've had a lot of people come on and discuss at various points is Gnosticism or Hermeticism, and I've had a few people talk about Christian mysticism. Now, all of these systems, I think a lot of people don't realize that they can sort of they overlap with each other. I think a lot of these traditions that we talk about in the esoteric world have a bit more interchanging than we sometimes think. And we also have to remember that these traditions are a lot more broad. They are not just like the singular version of it that people get from reading like a Wikipedia article, right? They are fully fleshed out traditions and they interface with our personal lives in really interesting ways because as individuals, we do have our own understanding of the things and beliefs. Can you introduce yourself and say a bit about yourself and what you believe and all that so people get a reference of who you might be?
Yeah, absolutely. I go by Bardationist on Twitter. At Insect Brah. I mean, people call me a lot of things, but I would say religiously, I subscribe to kind of like a Valentinian Gnostic system, but I've been involved in Gnostic studies in general, but also Hermetic and Kabbalistic and just general Abrahamic mysticism studies. I was really interested in Sufism at one point, but I tend to focus a lot on Gnosticism just because that's what I tend to believe. But I think it overlaps with the Hermeticism and the Kabbalah, and I'm interested in those religious systems in dialogue with each other because there's a lot of crossover.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Those are a lot of the same subjects that I've taken interested at various points. So can you sort of explain Valentinian Gnosticism? Because I think Gnosticism, people have this like, I don't know, I think people oversimplify Gnosticism and don't acknowledge that there are many different tendencies. And I've always found Valentinian Gnosticism to be the most kind of compelling. But can you tell people like what that is?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously Gnosticism is kind of it's a strange word because it covers so many different ideologies, some of which wouldn't have called themselves Gnostic, but Valentinianism was the biggest, alongside Sethianism, of the Gnostic systems, and it's kind of what you associate with like the Nag Hammadi library in general. There's a lot of Sethian text there, but it's more focused on Christ as opposed to Sethiism came out more of Hellenic Judaism. Seth they attribute their gnosis to, but also Sophia is a very significant figure, and there's kind of an extensive cosmology of the birth of a demiurge, which is the central figure of any Gnostic system. At least it's a common theme, but his birth through the asexual reproduction of Sophia. It was essentially an aeon of God. This is all ascribing anthropomorphic terms to intangible subjects, and essentially the one which emanated Christ, and the the system of gnosis, which is essentially divine knowledge that one obtains through inward reflection and asceticism and sort of releasing oneself from the chains of matter, and then ultimately your soul can return to the one. There's the system of nomadic, psychic, and hylic souls, which are kind of the orders of people who have either no soul and no spirit, a spirit but no soul, and a soul and a spirit. But kind of the key tenets are that dualism that you're going to have, and then finding God through oneself, looking inward. But there's an extensive cosmology. The aeonology kind of scares people off sometimes.
Yeah, so one thing that I think people like immediately wonder when they think about Gnosticism, I think a lot of people on their understanding of Gnosticism is very like it's very oriented around the demiurge subject, and I think when people bring Christ into it and mention Christ, a lot of people don't know like where Christ falls in this cosmology, right? Like I've heard different takes from just different Gnostics, some saying that like is Christ the son, like the son and the embodiment of the demiurge, or is Christ like the monad sort of overriding and conquering the demiurge? Where do you sort of stand on that subject and what is kind of the view of your system?
Yeah, I mean, Christ takes on a lot of different roles because these are independent but related. Sometimes not related with the context, like Cathars, who sometimes people call Gnostic. But in Valentinianism, Christ is kind of he's the luminary. There's a prologue, I think John, where it talks about Christ, in the canonical Bible, where it talks about Christ as the incarnated Logos. And essentially, the Valentinian system saw Christ as an aeon of God, sometimes associated with Sophia as a lower aeon, but sent in material form to bring knowledge, essentially to bring gnosis to people. So he's seen as more of a luminary than a redeemer. In traditional, lowercase Orthodox Christianity, Christ is the redeemer of sin, whereas in the Valentinian system, Christ has come to illuminate, to bring knowledge to people. Um, there's John 1:17 that for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came through Christ. No man has seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, and in him the bosom of the Father he has declared him. So it's essentially that Christ is an aspect of God incarnated as a human. There's a Gnostic treatise on the resurrection, which kind of merges Valentinian and Proto Orthodox beliefs, where it differentiates between the living Christ, the Christ crucified on the cross, the physical body, and the abstract Christ, the being of God.
That's really interesting. I think one of the big questions around Gnosticism is always, so what is kind of the material world, and is the material world sort of evil or a bit more complicated? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's also something that was discussed differently in the contemporary Gnostic systems, whereas the Valentinian system takes a little bit softer of an approach, but that matter is still ontologically evil. Though the demiurge is kind of a blind idiot god, as H.P. Lovecraft would have called it, and that he's sort of a victim of circumstance, not necessarily evil, just uh, ignorant. But the Neoplatonists were upset at the Gnostics for the idea of ontological evil, and which they didn't believe in, and thus that was a big you know debate on the material realm, I guess, is whether it's something that is necessary but not evil, or if it's necessary and evil. And the Gnostic system is kind of more hardline on matter in that regard.
Yeah, evil will always be one of the biggest questions in religion. Like, what is evil? Where does evil fall? Um, I've always it's one that I've gone back and forth on a lot, and a question that I think humans will continue to um argue about. I know Platonists have written a lot about Gnosticism. Do you think Platonists in their discussions on Gnosticism get Gnosticism right, or do you think they kind of carry misconceptions with them?
I mean, I think it depends. Plotinus wrote some of the most famous non-Christian polemics against the Gnostics, which at times just devolve into kind of ad hominem attacks. But I think that they had a better understanding of Gnosticism than maybe even the proto-Orthodox church fathers like Irenaeus, who were writing against it. I think they, you know, I think Plato would have felt differently, but they were obviously expounding on Platonism. They weren't exactly directly in the tradition of it. So I think that at least on the points, I don't know if they always got Gnosticism right, but on the points of evil where they were really focusing on, they did. But obviously, also Plotinus was a polytheist, so that was a big debate between them. And Gnosticism tended to be a Christian heresy, right? Early Christianity, so that was always something that got in the way beyond just the specifics of evil and cosmology, the role of the material realm, just the fact that they were generally religiously incompatible.
Yeah, and I think that's a thing that often gets kind of lost in like modern esoteric spaces, because there are a lot of like polytheist in the modern esoteric scene, especially if you're going straight into like full on occultism, right? But there's this like Gnostic influence, see this like weird merging of Gnosticism and polytheism, and this Gnostic disconnection from Christianity that just kind of historically didn't exist. that I think is kind of a strange modern development. I don't know if that's really quite something that existed historically and just kind of a thing that happens now. But another thing I wanted to touch on with you is aestheticism itself. A lot of mystic practices are deep into aestheticism. Do you think that, like, to be a Gnostic, you fundamentally have to embrace aestheticism to some extent?
I mean, I would say yes to some extent. Um, Gnosticism is a little looser around rituals and stuff like that. Um, Due to the fact that it's it's an inward focus, right? Valentinian saw the church as in the self, which was a big heresy. But there's some extent where to in order to reduce your grasp on the material, you have to practice it to some extent. But that's ultimately, with a few exceptions, a matter of personal rituals.
What sort of practices are kind of common amongst Gnostics, or that, like, you would kind of recommend to people to understand all that stuff?
I mean, as far as direct um, rituals, and just general asceticism, things like abstaining from sexual intercourse and fasting have been common threads throughout, because those are kind of this the central evils of matter, right? Outlined in the Bible too: lust, um, wealth hoarding, gluttony, stuff like that. So that's generally forbidden, just as a out of opposition to the material realm, and trying to reduce oneself on matter. Otherwise, it's kind of a lot of introspection. It's hard to exactly describe a ritual because it's so dependent upon the self. But trying to look inwards, Carl Jung, in his Black books, he talks about looking away from the world of Abraxas and then looking inward at oneself until you see the light blue glimmer of the one true God, something like that. But it's hard to put it into exact terms, which is kind of why Gnosticism gets lumped in a little bit more with esotericism, because there's not much that's actually occluded. What was occluded is thanks to the church fathers burning and destroying everything, but that personal element of the self, rather than of the church and of structured organized religion, that's what really differentiates it in the kind of esoteric sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I really like that emphasis on sort of that thinking. I've always argued, and one of the things that I've written about is that I feel like any successful esoteric discipline or personal practice has sort of three legs to it. There's study and learning, praxis, like actually doing things, and then contemplation. I think a lot of the times we miss the contemplation discussion. I think there's no way to truly achieve gnosis or any of these varieties without taking time to really look inwards and process our experiences with the divine. Now, you mentioned the church and all that. I think that is, oh god, whole complicated conversation. As a Gnostic, do you see any kind of value in those organizations, or do you see them as kind of like a corrupted path of some sort? Like, what's your stance on that? Because I feel like that, I don't know, I feel like that could go a bunch of different directions if you have kind of a Gnostic framework of thinking.
I see it in a few different ways. I can appreciate the personal ritual of prayer, in the very least. Although there's a saying, the only prayer you need is silence. But it's more the structure of the church telling you what to believe. Not even so much telling you what to believe, but how to practice it. A lot of Catholics I've met haven't even read the Bible, because they gain all their knowledge and all their beliefs and kind of the system of being ascribed to them through the priests, which I think is obviously a dangerous line to go down. So I think that if your personal ritual that brings in that introspection, which I think is it's a good word, it's really completely key to Gnosticism. That it's not a bad thing. You can practice in a church, but when you start to have your relationship with God through the medium of another person, that's when it becomes a big problem.
I completely agree with that. One of my biggest disagreements, like I'm a polytheist, I'm a perennialist, so I have a number of disagreements with my Catholic friends. But one of the big things that I always sort of end up going back and forth with them about is that, right? I don't like the idea of like listening to humans instead of the divine itself, right? And I'm not a Gnostic, but fundamentally that's the Gnostic principle that I would say agree with the most. I feel like what happens specifically with some forms of Christianity is they end up in this very weird position. I've noticed this a lot with the Catholics I'm close to, where they have big disagreements of like where an organization is going. I know a lot of Catholics are very unhappy with where the church is going right now, but they like continue clinging to this like deep like that relationship, right? Like they critique the organization, but they're still sort of bound to it in such an extreme way that I kind of struggle to understand fully, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who she's Catholic. She's a little, a little more mystical, I guess. Not even, outright, but just in her kind of outlook. But she's, had critiques of the Catholic Church, and she's kind of been ostracized from her Catholic community because she's unhappy with the direction of the church. And so I think that when you see the church as the be all end all and essentially the material body of Christ, no matter what they do, you have to kind of go along with it, even if that runs counter to your experience with religion or with your experience with God, because you're doing this through the medium of another organization, of another person.
Oh yeah, I think that's like a big thing I see in all sorts of people, and I even see it amongst like esoteric people. Like some occultists I know are in these various like orders or groups or whatever, and they get like the group will go in some weird direction they don't like, or they'll have some initiation where they discover something about the system they're part of that bothers them. But they continue to like stay in the system even though it's running counter to where their actual like spirituality is leading them and where their will and their gnosis is actually leading them. And it's I don't know, I feel like sometimes people we're so I think this has to be because we're so social. We're very bound to like sticking within our isms and our boxes in a way that I don't know is productive, because at the end of the day, like these organizations and these labels and these groups, they're not going to be with you when you die and we have the big, that's when it really matters what you're doing, right? Like I don't know, we it's funny, like we get clung to this material expression of religiosity and communities in a way that, I mean, community is good. I've had some great, amazing experiences in groups, but I don't know, it's this very weird dynamic that I feel like I guess Gnosticism could probably get you away from to some extent.
Yeah, I think that people are kind of inherently tribalistic and that we want to cling to groups. And I agree. I do think community is good. But, even with the famous mystic writers like Arthur Machen and Yeats and Arthur Conan Doyle, they were all members of the same like Hermetic Lodge, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, because that was like, if you were a mystic, that was the place to go, because they kind of, people seek out these groups, and obviously there's a lot of infighting. But I don't think groups are bad. I don't think it's bad to have a community, to have other people. But when you try to stick yourself into one philosophy with other people, and anytime you deviate from that, you kind of fall into the no true Scotsman, right? And so I think I do urge people to look, more to their self as an individual and sort of contemplate inwards rather than trying to stick to labels put on them by other people that they can't move away from, even if it does run counter to their personal experience with the divine or with whatever.
Yeah, so I know something that you have told me is you incorporate some like hermetic influences to what you do. How do you like sort of combine like Christian Gnostic stuff with hermetism? Do you think they go together naturally, or are there some sort of like, like contradictions to sort of seek out? Like how does that relationship work for you? Because I know they get kind of thrown in together a fair amount, but I do think there are some sort of different things in there. But also, Hermeticism is once again like Gnosticism, a giant school of thought. So, what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I mean, Hermeticism, which was obviously very popular during the medieval and early Renaissance period, that I see more as kind of a system of interacting and understanding the world. But there are a lot of crossovers. I mean, people think immediately of alchemy, they think of homunculi, stuff like that, the Hermetic sciences. But it's very much a religio-philosophical belief. And Paracelsus, right? He was a famous physician theologian. He was probably one of the more famous alchemists. But he sort of saw alchemy as in the material world providing like a literal panacea to physical health. But he also talks about in some of his first writings about creating a panacea to the material realm, to leave the material realm, right? That the material Hermeticism is maybe less alienated from this world than Gnosticism is, in the sense that it's both a system of finding knowledge and mastery within the world, but then ultimately escaping. But in Poimandres, Hermes, there's a quote about, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's about, he essentially says, how many cycles of the stars and aeons do we have to go through before we can hasten to the one alone? And in the Hermetic dialogues, there's a specific differentiation between, the world um, and its trappings, then the one, right? The infinite, with the Pythagoreans called the monad, which gets, it interacts with a lot of belief systems during the Hermetic era of, medieval Christianity. Like Kabbalah was a big element. I think Raymond Lull was the first to do that, but then like Ficino and Mirandola really popularized it. There's the element of Ein Sof, which is the infinite. So that contrast between this world and the infinite, the one, as being, the one being wholly superior, that carries a lot over to Gnosticism. I think that even though they're technically unrelated, they came to a lot of the same conclusions, and I consider, Hermeticism, at least, the Corpus Hermetica, um, as sort of within that tradition, at least, logical development in the tradition. There were several Hermetic dialogues put in the Nag Hammadi library, which is the biggest compendium of Gnostic texts written in Coptic out of Greek, buried underground, which is how we know about almost all of what we knew about Gnosticism prior to the discovery of the library was through the Proto-Orthodox Church fathers writing polemics against it, which turned out to be somewhat incorrect. Um, but I see them as kind of compatriots. You don't need to practice Hermeticism to be a Gnostic, nor do you need to be a Gnostic to subscribe to Hermeticism. That Gnosticism had kind of disappeared due to the efforts by the church during the medieval era, but those same kind of ideas came up again. And obviously, alchemy was incredibly popular, and generally the sciences revolved around that. But even down to the imagery of dragons and serpents, a lot of alchemical art, you'll see two dragons eating each other's tails as a symbol of the world separated from God. And you see this in the Ophites, which were a serpent-focused Gnostic Christian group. So there's a lot of themes that run alongside each other. So I think they're compatible. Maybe Neoplatonism, at least non-Christian Neoplatonism, isn't so compatible with Gnosticism, but I think Hermeticism definitely is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I do find that this is a thing that happens again and again and again. Like every time there's a move to try to like destroy the writings of a religious sect or get rid of their ideas or suppress it or write polemics against it, it always ends up kind of rearing its head again, right? Like it's a lot of these ideas, and I would say it's because they're spiritual ideas that are eternal and perennial, but they always come back in some form. Like there's, you know what I mean? They can't ever fully get rid of them, no matter how hard they try. Which is it's always interesting to see. You mentioned the serpent. What does the serpent kind of mean in Gnosticism? What does that imagery mean? Because I think like in the Western consciousness, we have sort of two associations with the serpent, right? We see it as either the taboo, the evil. I guess these are three. I can't count. The taboo, the evil, or knowledge itself. Like, what is the association in Gnosticism, and where does that come from?
Yeah, it's funny because in Gnosticism, the serpent, at least the imagery, kind of rests at towards the height of creation, and then the lowest forms of it obviously the demiurge, whether you call it Samael, Yaldabaoth, Socklus, there's a lot of words for the demiurge, is depicted as serpent bodied and lion headed. And so that's the kind of serpent that you would have seen in the Hermetic art. But then there's also the serpent of Eden, which is seen as a luminary, a liberator figure, almost a precursor to Christ. The Ophites, as it was written, we don't have that much firsthand from them, but essentially believed Christ and the serpent to be the same. And a lot of those early, prologues to Genesis, you have, the Adam and Eve are essentially being kept in a flesh puppet dominion. They have they don't have knowledge, they don't have these experiences. It's quote unquote paradise, but within the Gnostic system, that's kind of the prison of the demiurge, and that the serpent and the fruit of knowledge was ultimately a liberation. It gave brought gnosis to Adam and Eve and allowed them to carry that on to humanity, which is obviously upsetting to the god in the garden, which is often conflated with the demiurge, not just because it's the world creating spirit, but also because it's not attributed to the formless, infinite omnipresence that we'd associate with God. I think a robe flapping around is mentioned. God can't find Adam in the garden. He calls out to him. So that was kind of the basis for some of the dualistic readings of early creation texts. But this is something I've talked about before, and I do find it really interesting. The complementary roles of the serpent, and one being a kind of illuminary messianic figure, and the other being the literal creator of matter, the ultimate evil in the Gnostic system.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering, do Gnostics or your strain of Gnosticism specifically have like a view on like sort of the traditionally seen as evil entities in the Christian world, like devil, Lucifer, the snake in the garden, all that's well, obviously we talked about the snake there, but the other ones, like, is there like a Gnostic reading on all that, or is that kind of just something that exists in Christianity but doesn't really follow into Gnosticism?
I mean, the focus is more on the demiurge and Gnosticism. Figures like, Satan are sometimes, equated to archons, but I think, in one of the books, Satan is described as a cherub, and the cherubim are evil forces in Valentinian Gnosticism. And the hypostasis of the archons, Sabaoth, which is, it's the Hebrew word for ruler, but one of the primary archons is brought on a chariot of three-headed cherubim. So those are kind of seen as the servants of the demiurge, but the demiurge is more associated with like Yahweh, or the world creating spirit, much larger than Satan. The Cathars sometimes equated their demiurge with Satan, the creator of the material realm, but they're they get called Gnostic, but they're their own thing. I think you brought up perennial truths, and I think that falls into that. But generally speaking, you don't see Satan play such a significant role, although you don't really see it in Christianity either. John Milton in his Paradise Lost kind of expanded on it and created the contemporary image of Lucifer or Satan, and it's mentioned as just kind of a foil to God, but isn't particularly expounded upon. Like texts like Milton's have sort of shaped the popular understanding of Christianity to the sense that it's become essentially canon in people's eyes, even though it was written as fiction. I love Dante. The Divine Comedy is one of my favorite poetic pieces ever composed, but it was not meant as a physical canon religious text, but it's kind of made it that way, and how we understand hell, just through Dante's poetic imagination. And of course, there are people who believe he literally went to hell at the center of the earth, but that's kind of a more of a Swedenborgian kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, I feel like a lot of my conversations have gotten back to Dante. Like, the way that we have sort of merged our, like, fictitious and artistic understandings of religion with our actual understanding of religion is kind of just a fascinating phenomenon. I think that there's clearly, like I don't know, I guess you could get into, like, a weird kinda chaos way of thinking about it and get into, like, egregores and thought forms, and you could I'm sure you could go down that route with it, but I mean, I feel like there's so much speculation on why specifically those pieces have solidified things in our mind because I mean, a lot of what we talk about, I mean, it doesn't have as much root in the text as we think it does. Now, you mentioned a ways back the term aeon in a quote that you said. In your view of Gnosticism, is there sort of a concept of like aeons and time in that way? Because it's something that I've discussed a fair amount. I'm a big believer in the aeons and aeonic succession. I know that the Hindus are also fascinated by it. Does Gnosticism have a sort of view like that, or is that just kind of that one guy in that quote who said that term?
I mean, the aeons are significant, but funnily enough, they're kind of independent of the sense of aeons in time. I think the etymology is different. Aeons are essentially the emanation of God. When I was talking about the Hermetic quote, I don't think he literally says eons, but that was, just because I guess because time runs in circles, and both Valentinian Gnosticism and Hermeticism have kind of the concept of reincarnation, and not in quite the Eastern sense, but the re-experience of the soul before achieving gnosis and returning to God. There's that sense of time that he says the cycles of the stars, Hermes in Poimandres. But there's also the term aeon, which means the emanations of God, kind of equivalent to the sephira in the Kabbalistic systems. There's even a specific world creating sephirot that brought about the breaking of the vessels, which is the ultimate world creating tragedy in Kabbalistic Judaism. But it is interesting that those that those words sound pretty similar.
Yeah, I guess I got a little confused there. It's still an interesting thought. So I was wondering, like, I know you're Gnostic and all that. Do you use like traditional Christian mystic techniques in what you do? Like, I was curious, like, do you sort of borrow any of that, and whatnot? Like, what is your experience with all that?
I mean, it's hard to say exactly if I would borrow Christian mystic techniques. I mean, I obviously Gnosticism, at least in the early Christian form, is essentially a form of Christian mysticism. But like I said, beyond like the ascetic rituals that are practiced, it ultimately depends on the person. Like prayer is allowed, but not necessary exactly, as long as you have some kind of communication with God. For me, that's it's a form of prayer. I mean, it's introspection and you know just kind of thought on subjects, but so much of the structured ritual I don't find so much. Like I said, it's okay if that's how you go about your relationship with God, but church services, the Eucharist, stuff like that are not necessary. There's a kind of Gnostic belief in Syria called the Alawites, and they do the same Eucharist kind of thing. Consecrating with wine and bread, but it's not necessary. That's kind of one of the things that confuses people about Gnosticism, is that there's not such a set tradition, at least in how you interact with the divine. Like I said, besides those ascetic rules. So it does take from the Bible. In First John 2:15, I think. It says you cannot love the world or anything in the world and love the Father. If you have love for the world, lust, stuff like that, then you cannot love the Father. The love for the Father is not in you. So that element of separation from the world, that's definitely carried forward. But in terms of like actual techniques, it's not so universal across the board.
Speaking of lust, when you are talking about lust and like sexual aestheticism and all that, does that apply broadly or only if it is like extramarital type stuff?
It's interesting because we don't have so much information early on. The Cathars established a very strict sexual morality. But it seems that, at least in the Gnostic system, because these, religious institutions aren't necessarily respected the same way, that marriage doesn't take on quite the same role that it does, and that it's more about, lust, sex for pleasure, rather than, premarital or postmarital sex. It doesn't become immediately accepted as soon as you're married.
That's really interesting because that does that runs kind of contrary to what a lot of people assume. But that makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Is there a general is there this is what I'm curious. Is there any role for hedonism anywhere in Gnosticism, or is it all in all cases kind of a bad thing? Is there any place for the Dionysian side of things, or is that just like a no?
I mean, you know, not everything was focused on so strictly in aesthetic morality as sex or diet. It was more about how it relates to the person. But hedonism, in the sense of reveling in this world, at least in the major forms of Gnosticism, that runs kind of counter to the philosophy. There were a sect called the Carpocratians, who it's interesting because we only know about them through church fathers, and they're alleged to be like extremely hedonistic because they believed that their material bodies were deteriorating and that they were going to return to God so they could, revel in their material bodies. But that kind of debauchery was something often alleged against heretics by the church. So it was really difficult to know if that was genuinely their philosophy. You had some allegations of that against the Cathars, despite no evidence. And just sort of, actually, when it comes to Dionysus, when there were comparisons between Christ and Dionysus, the church wrote like elaborate homosexual fan fiction about Dionysus to dissuade people from making those connections. But hedonism is generally just contrary, just based on the fact that it is focused on the material. I guess if you had some non-materialistic hedonism, I don't know exactly how that would work. Maybe you
I
could
guess
have some negotiation.
non-materialistic hedonism would be like what, like reading a good book or something?
Yeah,
Or like thinking about something that's cool? Like daydreaming? I don't know. I'm trying to think of what that could even be.
books and music and art, take a role, especially because they, it's kind of assume they come from the soul, right? They come from creativity rather than from the world. A painting doesn't just exist, manifested, nor does a piece of musical arrangement. Music is really sacred in the Sufist tradition. But so that kind of pleasure, I guess, that focus, that's more about expression of the soul and expression of the self, and in word, that's the kind of hedonism that you're going to see in Gnosticism and in Hermeticism. There's a lot of Hermetic art, a lot of it allegorical, because a lot of alchemical texts are written in images. The Liber Mutus and the Ripley Scroll don't really have any text. I mean, Liber Mutus doesn't have any text at all. You kind of just have to understand based on what we know of, because a lot of Hermetic wisdom is much better preserved than Gnosticism, because the church, it was a weird time during the Middle Ages. There was a lot of mysticism going on. Like I said, Mirandola and Ficino, a lot of influence from Kabbalah and Neoplatonism, and it's kind of just permitted. It was understood as accepted in conversation with lowercase Orthodox Christianity. Even Hildegard von Bingen, right? She was very much a Catholic, but you had a lot of these mystical elements, visions that you don't really see later on. The church really kind of cleaned itself up, and really purged all of that. Even Agrippa eventually was kind of attacked for heresy, despite initially being an accepted Renaissance Christian theologian, who wrote the books of occult philosophy. He was drawing from alchemy and Kabbalah. He was an alchemist and a hermeticist. But yeah, it's funny, how that works, how things change over time, and how our understanding is kind of shaped by what is left behind.
Oh yeah. It absolutely is. We know these things because of really what people kept talking about and writing about, right? I wanted to ask you about alchemy. I've noticed Gnosticism and alchemy sometimes get kind of put in the same conversation, along with really everything in Western esotericism. How does the Gnostic worldview connect to alchemy, and are they sort of compatible, and do they work together and all that?
I mean, alchemy, isn't. necessary. Like I said, Hermeticism and Gnosticism, at least as we understand them, developed as very similar but necessarily distinct forms of thought. Both were influenced by both Christianity and Hellenistic beliefs, Platonic beliefs. So those kind of perennial wisdom. But you can be a Gnostic and an alchemist if you want. They're not incompatible in the sense that because Hermeticism is kind of seeking to uh, unlock the secrets of the material world and of matter. Uh, you can have that while also, like I said, Paracelsus had his, panchaea to the material realm to escape the body, to escape matter, and return to the one, as it's called. But alchemy is definitely a hermetic art. It wouldn't have been around during the first AD times of the Gnostics, and by the medieval era, Gnosticism had kind of been forgotten due to those effective attempts by the church fathers. So they're not incompatible. I mean, I find both really interesting. I find, alchemy made a lot of strides in how we understand the world, both in medicine and obviously in chemistry. I still have hope for that magnum opus, the union of red sulfur and quicksilver. But um, yeah, they're accepted within each other, but they're not necessarily components of the same philosophy.
That makes a lot of sense. That's kind of what my sort of conception of that was. I feel like I have to ask the most basic question ever because I always find this like an interesting one to hear from people. What do you think the biggest misconception people hold about Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and all these subjects is?
Man, I mean, the list could go on for days. Gnosticism is probably one of the most poorly understood terms, especially as it becomes a buzzword for something I don't like, which are essentially based only in an understanding of the spirit as different from the body. And so a lot of people just read the Wikipedia page, or they don't even read it; they just hear about it. But like, I saw a tweet alleging that like Nick Land and Adolf Hitler were all like Gnostics or something. And it's kind of lost all meaning at this point. It's just a term that means anything I don't like. Hermeticism, it's maybe a little bit better understood, but also people don't really talk about it as much. It's not a buzzword. Uh, I think people sometimes like there's a book called The Kabbalion, which professes itself to be hermetic, but it's really based only on a vague understanding of a couple parts of the Emerald Tablet. And so that kind of like the Helena Blavatsky influence and the Masonic lodges, or even just the Rosicrucian. That's really where it begun. Elements of Hermeticism, you kind of just have a different, more modern spiritualism, New Age occult philosophy that is sometimes conflated with Hermeticism. But that's not as much of a big topic just because people don't talk about Hermeticism as much. Not that many people are talking about the Kabbalion or Theosophy or anything like that.
Oh god, I could go on a massive rant about the whole like everything I hate is Gnosticism or those like takes because I'm like you just mean anti-materialism a lot of the time and it's just it lacks nuance. I think there's a place for discussing like some X or Y thing is kind of a secular religion, but I think that's probably the term you should use for it. I I feel that pain. I feel that irritation. Because I have to hold myself back sometimes. If I talk about Nick Land, I'll get canceled again. I got in trouble last time I talked about Nick Land, and the every other time. Um, but yeah, on the Kabbalion, I went on a crazy rant about the. I have like a whole. I think I have a YouTube video on the Kabbalion where I like read the entire. I think I go through every single point and I explain my honest thoughts on it. In terms of like the lodges thing, I have like I've created this amazing term that I made up. Neo Hermeticism, classical Hermeticism, and I refer to them as different things and I'm hoping eventually this catches on, right? Like neo hermeticism, classical hermeticism. Someone eventually, I'm hoping people think that it's good to put them in two separate terms. This is like my mission. One day I will make this this like an accepted term thing because I feel like that saves everyone like so much conversation because it really is. It's neo hermeticism, right? It's an elaboration on top of classical hermeticism. Is how I see it. I don't know if that's how you feel about it, but that's what I've observed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different school of thought altogether. It does borrow from Hermetic concepts, but even in the sense of that like Kabbalion type Hermeticism, a lot of it's based on there's kind of a paraphrase of a section of the Emerald Tablet that people say as above, so below, and people kind of just take that and run with it without the rest of the Corpus Hermeticum. But obviously every philosophical system, religious system will have its perversions and its expansions on it, so it's kind of an inevitable thing. So differentiating between them is probably as good as we're going to get.
Probably. Yeah, I think my view on like everything New Age, and I feel like this is what I say about every single thing I'm asked about the New Age, is I'm like, well, it's kind of right, but it's more complicated than that. Like that's typically what I say to it. Like I'm like, yeah, you've got the starting point. Like the Kabbalion, the starting points are there, but it's missing a lot of complexity. It's like watered down. That's kind of the way that I feel about most of the New Age. And then they'll add like really weird stuff on top of things, and I'm like, okay, you're losing me now. You had me, you've lost me completely. Now I gotta, like for those who are interested in Gnosticism and Hermetism and learning about these things, like what would you recommend people read and look after? Like if you listen to this podcast and you're like, I'm super agreeing with all of this. This is, you know, rung some bells in my head. Where do you think people should go next after this conversation?
I mean, pretty much in terms of Gnosticism, pretty much the entire Nag Hammadi library is available online. Some of the more famous Gospels might be somewhere to start, like the Gospel of Mary, the Secret Book of John, the Gospel of Philip. There's a lot of texts. The Thunder Perfect Mind is an interesting Gnostic poem from the Nag Hammadi library. And you have the Hypostasis, the Archons, uh, the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, which is a Sethian piece comparing Set, the Egyptian god, and Seth, the son of Adam and Eve, to whom their gnosis is attributed. That's, in terms of Gnosticism, really the best place to get an understanding is because almost everything else, even like the astute studies of Irenaeus get a lot wrong now that we actually have these texts, now that we know. It's kind of daunting. I mean, it's a big, several codices um, library, but there's a lot of more popular texts that are pretty easy to find. Um, but in terms of Hermeticism, again, kind of going to the source is really my recommendation. The Corpus Hermeticum is pretty widely available. You should be able to find all those texts online. Also, I personally enjoy the works of those early Hermeticists who were there practicing real Hermeticists, Paracelsus, Agrippa, John Dee, who are all involved and actually practicing Hermeticism as laid out by the secret teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. But those are kind of where I would go for texts. I mean, with in conversation with Hermeticism, just because Kabbalah is such an integral part later on Christian Kabbalah. The Zohar is also a readily available text. Gershom Shoam has a paraphrased version that's good to start out. He was a scholar of Jewish mysticism, one of the Aranos guys. So kind of all those. Carl Jung has some good writings on Hermeticism. He has his own Gnostic writings. He has Seven Sermons to the Dead, which is his personal like Gnostic gospel that he distributed among his friends and followers, but never published officially. He was, one of the first codices of the Nag Hammadi library is called the Young Codice. If you're looking to like sort of gain a broader understanding, but personally, I just try to go to the source.
That makes a lot of sense. I would like to give my pitch once again for the title of Agrippa. I think we should rename it the Occult Lawnmower Manual because it has everything you need, but it is dry. I really I need to like get the rights to like repackage it and just call it like the Occult Lawnmower Manual and just sell it like that. This is my vision. This is my plan. This is my true will that I'm manifesting. Anyways, where on the internet can people find you? What do you create? Where do you exist? Where's your little corner if people particularly want to hear more of what you have to say?
Yeah, I mean, at Insect Brah on Twitter is mostly where I'm active. You'll find me there. I talk about as much as Twitter allows me to about theology on there, and also my first full book is out. It's called Somnambulisms by my legal name, Dylan Joaquin. So that's out there if for any fans of horror and mysticism and of fiction. But otherwise, I'm mostly centered around Twitter, so that's where people are going to find me.
Lovely. I'm your host, Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. I am everywhere there is on the internet. I'm predominantly a YouTuber, so find me on YouTube. You can also listen to this podcast on YouTube or on all the podcasting platforms. I'm also on Twitter, Telegram, TikTok, Instagram, Substack, everywhere. I'm everywhere. And if you want to support this show, we are supported through Patreon. So please check out the Patreon. It gets you my pre-show, which I record for a little bit before my guest shows up, which is just kind of me rambling about things. I give a bonus episode every single equinox and cross quarter. I use the Wiccan Sabbath timing. I'm not a Wiccan, but it's a good release schedule, so you guys get that. It's 8 episodes a year. And I give all these episodes early. It's about a week early. And if you're a high enough tier and you really actually help us support us with a decent contribution, I will read your name out at the end of every single episode. Though you can opt out of this if you would prefer privacy and don't want me to read your name out, which some people don't like. I understand that. So thank you so much to these people for keeping the show running. In particular, thank you to Tom Bombaldi, Ruben Trevino, Shiraz, Lee Smalter. Thank you so much for your continued support and help. And this has been the Postmodern Iconoclast. I hope you are having a nice day, afternoon, mid morning, mid afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. All right.